Hello, Bob Riedfeld here, preaching and teaching minister of the Spring Hill Christian Church of Rural Oak, Lockney, Georgia. And welcome to another lesson on the Doctrine of God. Last week we started talking about the providence of God, and we said that it was going to be divided into two sections, general providence and special providence. And last week we started talking about general providence. We talked about the preservation of nature, the process of nature, providence, and natural law. As well as general providence and human beings. Today we're going to talk about, Today we're going to start talking about special providence and what that all incurs. The special providence is God's direct action upon the world in specific times and places for specific purposes, without violating either natural law or free will, to bring about results not obtainable by unaided natural processes and uninfluenced free will. So let's take a look at the biblical data. First of all, God's universal control and kingship. He is the universal king who reigns over all. God's control, we see God's control of Israel's history and his general conduct of nations interacting with Israel. The Old Testament data are very important for understanding special providence. The conquest of Canaan, the period of the Judges, the period of the United Monarchy, the period of the divided monarchy. Then we have God's control of the church, opening and closing doors. God's control of the decisions of individuals. The controls of nations usually involves the control of individuals. The lives and deeds of individual are indeed in God's control. God controls the lives and deeds of kings. God controlled people's attitudes toward Israel. God prepares specific individuals for service. Moses and David and Jeremiah, Paul, the Pharaoh. God opens the hearts of individuals. And then God controls even the sinful decisions of individuals. Many of the things God accomplishes via special providence involve sinful decisions and deeds. In some sense, God is in control of them in ways that enable him to accomplish his purposes. Example, the hardening of hearts, Joseph's brothers, sending evil spirits upon an individual, aggressive, cruel warfare, such as Assyria, talked about in Isaiah, and Babylon, talked about in Habakkuk, Judas. In all these cases, the point is made very clear. God is doing these things. So, what is at stake in the question of special providence? Two things: the nature of God's sovereignty and the nature of man's free will. The nature of God's sovereignty. Does God's sovereign control over history mean that he causes or determines everything, or is there some other way to define sovereignty? In any case, how can we explain God's causation, control, use of sinful decisions and deeds? The second thing, the nature of man's free will. How can we be true to all the biblical teaching about God's sovereignty and special providence, and at the same time maintain a view of man's free will? Biblical determinists, for example, Calvinists, believe that this can be done only by redefining free will. But is this necessary? So, how can we explain God's involvement in and control of history? God's original and overall continuing purpose in reference to his creation is twofold: to glorify himself and to share his goodness. This will always remain constant. God's primary means or way of accomplishing this general purpose has changed, however. The original means or way of accomplishing this purpose was creation itself. However, the entrance of sin into God's creation has altered the means by which his general purpose will be fulfilled. Because of sin, God's original purpose must now be fulfilled through his work of redemption in Christ. God's work of special providence mostly revolves around his special purpose of redemption, which is the present means by which he is accomplishing his general purpose. In Old Testament times, God's principal specific purpose was quite simply to prepare for the coming of the Redeemer. This special purpose of preparation took the form of choosing a specific nation and using them to prepare for Christ's coming. The nation chosen for this purpose was Israel. Thus, Israel becomes the means for accomplishing the purpose of bringing Christ into the world, which is the means of accomplishing the purpose of redemption, which is the means of accomplishing God's general purpose of glorifying himself and sharing his goodness. All of God's works of special providence for Israel and the surrounding nations must be understood in light of this special purpose for Israel. Because of this special role for the nation of Israel, God's purpose for Israel was unique. Thus, his providential dealings with this nation and her neighbors were unique. Thus, we cannot generalize from God's special providence in relation to Israel. In other words, we cannot assume that God's dealings with Israel are a pattern or a paradigm for his dealings with all nations in all times. There's no reason to assume that in Old Testament times, God was working with other nations not connected with Israel in the same way he was working with Israel and her neighbors. There's no reason to assume that he is doing so today either. God's special purpose for believers in the New Testament age have been raised to a higher spiritual level. He protects us from spiritual enemies. He provides us with spiritual prosperity. He gives us spiritual health. One form of special providence is God's manipulation of natural laws as a means of influencing human decisions. Natural laws usually operate in terms of their God-given relative independence. But the sovereign God remains omnipresent to his work and maintains control over its processes so that he can intervene if he chooses. He does this in two ways: via miracles, which are acts of God that violate natural laws, and via special providence, which are acts of God that stay within the boundaries of natural laws, but alter its course in ways that bring about results that would not have happened otherwise. By intervening in natural law in the latter sense, God can influence and control the decisions and deeds of men. This is kind of indirect control of human decision by means of direct control of men's external circumstances. Biblical examples of such intervention in natural law we have in Job, Haggai, death, life, muscle movements, animal behavior. Another form of special providence is God's control of mental states external to the will itself. Uh, God opens hearts. God softens hearts. God hardens hearts. Other kinds of indirect control are the power of the Word of God. The Word moves the will toward faith. Romans 10:17 and Romans 1:16. For example, the power of the Word in the case of Cyrus. Ezra 1:1, Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. Other kinds of indirect control would be the control of life circumstances as a way of preparing leaders. For example, Moses and Paul. Dissemination of reports of God's mighty power. God may possibly exert direct control on the will as a last resort. Indisputable cases of God's control of the body, though not necessarily of the will. Possible cases of control of the will itself, hardening hearts, favor and fear toward Israel, political and military decisions. Just see Proverbs 16:1 and Proverbs 21:1. If anything like this is done, it is not done universally, but is selective in terms of God's carrying out his special purposes. It is the exception, not the rule. Such acts as of special providence that suspend free will would be comparable in frequency to miracles as the suspension of natural laws. This means that all such control would be towards service, not salvation. And this is the key to understanding Romans chapter 9 through 11. God does not use direct control to cause men to sin. Most sin occurs under God's general providence, within God's permissive will and control. God may possibly influence evil choices indirectly by means of special providence, but not directly. And even this would be a problem in view of James 1:13. Then we have the nature of sovereignty. Christian determinism's concept of sovereignty is sovereignty requires that God be the absolute cause of all things. This is done by means of eternal decree. The decree is eternal, comprehensive. It's in connection with the previous point, comprehensive, that raises problems in the case of sin. Thus, with the reference to sin, the decree is sometimes considered to be permissive, and then it's considered to be unconditional. The key idea is in the last point, unconditionality. God always acts, he never reacts. Nothing about God can be conditioned in any sense by a creature. This is absolutely essential to sovereignty. This is the Christian determinism's concept of sovereignty. The biblical non-determinist concept of sovereignty, the concept of divine self-limitation. God may sovereignly choose to limit himself. Creation in itself is an act of divine limitation. The creation of a world that is relatively independent, in other words, with natural laws and free will creatures, is an even further self-limitation on the part of God. This is not a threat to sovereignty, but an expression of it. It is self-limitation, a free act. God maintains the right and power to intervene within the creation at any time. And then control. Control. Not necessarily causation is the key to God's sovereignty. And in control, general providence, God remains in watchful control even under general providence. He maintains the right and the power to either permit or to prevent any imminent event. Thus, he has the final word on whatever happens, even if he chooses not to intervene in the natural course of things. And then control, regard to special providence, God intervenes to influence the course of human decisions and events in indirect ways. Thus, he can control without causing. The nature of God's control as exercised through special providence is truly special. It is the exception, not the rule. It is in most cases resistible. Free will is respected. Miracles, of course, God may also intervene directly and miraculously anytime he chooses, and thus control by means of direct causation. Sovereignty defined as control is more worthy and noble a concept than sovereign defined as pure causation. The kind of control is possible because of God's foreknowledge and his omnipotence. God's foreknowledge of man's decisions and choices and intended actions enable him to plan and work his purposes in and through them. The prime example is the betrayal and crucifixion of Jesus. God's foreknowledge allows him to remain in control even though man's decisions are free. So, the nature of free will. The Christian determinist concept of free will is that a person's choices are determined by his own inner desires and motives. God plants within the human heart whatever inner desires and motives are necessary to produce whatever he chooses he wants to cause. The person making the choices in no sense feels coerced, but is freely choosing according to his own desires and motives, which have, of course, been placed there by God. Thus, a person is psychologically free. Thus, God indirectly, yet infallibly causes every choice, while the person who is choosing is consciously making a free choice. This view is called compatibilism, since free will is in this way said to be compatible with determinism. This view of free will is linked with the concept of concurrence or second causes. This is the determinist notion that every event has two concurrent causes. God alone is the ultimate and efficacious cause of every event and every human decision. At the same time, most events have secondary causes, such as natural laws and human free will decisions. They are said to be genuine causes. But the biblical, the non-determinist concept of free will must include the ability to choose between opposites, the power of opposite choice, even if a person is more inclined toward one choice than the other. The choice is not fixed or determined by some power outside the person himself. The individual is the one who is finally responsible for his or her choices. And in this way, human beings who are made in the image of God are the creators of events. This does not mean that human beings have total autonomy or independence from God. They only have a relative independence. Nevertheless, it's a relative independence. Therefore, the doctrine of concurrence must be rejected. The determinism's fatal flaw is unconditionality. To the determinist, God can be truly sovereign only if he is unconditioned in every way. Unconditional decree, unconditional foreknowledge, unconditional grace. These concepts are unacceptable because they are internally incoherent and inconsistent. There are no true permission, no true second causes, and no true free will in an unconditional decree. There is no true free will according to them. You can see a further study on this in Dr. Jack Cottrell's The Nature of Divine Sovereignty, and in The Grace of God, The Will of Man by Clark Pinnock. No true second causes. Secondary causes are not true causes. They are only instruments. The concept of 100% of God and 100% of man is inconsistent. Some have used the idea of a dual authorship of the Bible, interpreted in terms of primary and secondary causes, as a way of explaining how they believe the Bible can be both inspired and inerrant at the same time. The inspiration of God is the primary cause of the origin of the Bible, but the authorship of finite human beings is the secondary cause. And then they say that the latter may result in errors without the former being responsible for them, even though the Bible is fully inspired. The analogy is that human beings, as the secondary causes of sin, are the only ones responsible for it, even though it's 100% caused by God on the primary level. My response is that neither inspiration nor sovereignty consists of 100% God and 100% man. Each side contributes as necessary to accomplish God's purposes, the total adding up to his 100% purpose. And in the determinist, there's no true permission. God's knowledge of what he has determined to do via his decree is not true foreknowledge. It is not distinct from the decree itself. Sovereign grace is self-contradictory. The solution to the problem is to reject the arbitrary ideal of unconditionality as essential to divine sovereignty. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop. Hope you have enjoyed this lesson. I know it gets a little bit deep, but it's something to chew on. And next week we're going to go into our next section, the sovereign. We're going to talk about the nature of sovereignty, the attributes of sovereignty, and the intimacy of sovereignty. So I hope you've enjoyed this lesson as much as I have enjoyed studying and presenting it to you. I hope you have a great rest of the day and the rest of the week. And may God bless you.